Black, Indigenous, and racialized people often experience microaggressions, a form of harmful racism that can have lifelong impact. Our next guest describes them as death by 1,000 paper cuts. With more on what they are, how harmful they are, and the effects that they have, and some solutions. We're joined by anti-racism coach Salem Debs. Welcome to Your Morning.
Thank you.
Good to have you in studio. Some have called this term microaggressions even a misnomer because there's nothing small about the effects of that kind of racism. How would you define them?
Well, racial microaggressions are really, brief and commonplace, daily. They're verbal, behavioral, and environmental indignities. And, they could be intentional or unintentional, but they are communicated by hostile and derogatory racial slights and insults that really impact Black, Indigenous, and racialized people. And when people think of micro, they think of small. But really what we're trying to say is that there is macro, which is systemic racism or systemic, biases. And then there's the micro, which is daily and interpersonal, and they are incredibly harmful and are a death by 1,000 paper cuts and impact the mental health of Black, Indigenous, and racialized people.
Let's go through a few examples, which I appreciate you bringing to light and talking through how harmful their effects can be. You've broken it down into 3 common phrases that you've learned that are actually microaggressions. So let's start with the first one. I know this one. Where are you actually from?
Yes. Where are you actually from? Where are you really from? It usually starts with the question, where are you from? The person often responds by saying, I'm from Toronto. And then they say, no, where are you really from? Where are you actually from? And that comes with the assumption that Black and racialized people are, inherently from somewhere else, and that this idea of Canadian identity is rooted in, whiteness. And so it's important for us to really begin to examine that and recognize, obviously, the original inhabitants of this land are Indigenous people. We have settlers, we have migrants, we have immigrants, but also, for example, Black people have been here in Canada from the 1600s. Yes, and so another common phrase that we also, see is this idea of, you're so articulate. People say to me often when they hear me speak, and I know it's a common experience for a lot of Black and racialized people.
I'm cringing as you say it because the assumption would be, why would the assumption be that you would be anything else?
Right, so the assumption is, it's code for, I'm surprised that you speak as well as you do for a Black person or a racialized person. And so it's important for us to begin to examine our ideas around professionalism and what we mean when we say well-spoken and who we place that label upon and we have those assumptions about.
The final one comments on someone's appearance. What is an example of this and why is it harmful?
Well, one example that I experience, often I know is an experience of many Black women and Black people, is, comments about your hair. Like, your hair is so interesting, or wanting to touch your hair. And I experience this in the grocery store, in workspace environments. And it's really rooted in a history of, enslavement and colonialism and the entitlement to Black bodies and the fetishization and exploitation and exotification of Black bodies. So this idea of othering, which leads to dehumanization. And so we have to recognize that that kind of fascination with people comes from a very biased place.
And to give yourself a beat to think about why you're asking before you ask.
Right.
We said we would offer some solutions, and so I'd love to have you share some of those.
Yeah, so I would say some of the solutions, one solution would be, firstly, investing in unlearning and relearning. So it's the recognition that we have all been socialized and conditioned to have belief systems. And so beginning to unlearn, the ideas and perspectives that you unconsciously think, and then relearning. And you do that by investing in anti-racism and equity work. You look into books and authors, and you also Google. Google can be your best friend so that you're not placing the burden on Black, Indigenous, and racialized people to educate you. Also, we want to examine our language. Like, what type of language are you using? Are you using language like developing countries or third world countries or first world countries, recognizing that that comes from a hierarchy or dehumanization of different groups of people. And we want to move towards language where we're saying things like the global South or the global North, or countries who have been impacted by colonialism, or we might even say the global majority, because Black and Indigenous and racialized people are not minorities, but rather we are the global majority. We also want to recognize that we have to examine and reflect on our own identities and how we've been shaped. So, for example, your race, your gender, your sexual orientation, where you grew up, what access to education you've had, shapes your belief systems. There's no such thing as neutrality. So how are you beginning to understand the ways in which your beliefs have been shaped? And then I would say that the last aspect would be starting to recognize that we have to change your lens. And changing your lens comes from, what kind of content are you taking in daily unconsciously? And you begin to change your lens by taking in more Black, Indigenous, and racialized content so that you start to move out of that kind of idea of dominant culture socialization, and you begin to unlearn and relearn in that way as well.
Take a look at your dominant defaults.
Right.
Salam, great to have you here. Thanks so much for coming back.
Thank you so much.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you liked this, be sure to subscribe here, or you can check out more Your Morning videos right here.